Camp Pinewood, Lake Champlain, Vermont. The final evening of the first session, August 1953. Ellie Greenbaum, 10, Crown Heights, Brooklyn, had been at camp for 53 days. She was standing at the edge of the fire ring with a candle in her hand. The candle had been lit from the campfire. Everyone at Camp Pinewood was holding one. Every camper, every counselor, the kitchen staff who rarely appeared at program events, the camp director, who had stood at this same fire ring for 17 closing ceremonies. The camp had gathered in the dark around the fire for the last time this summer, and the fire at the center of the ring was the same fire ring where the session had opened 8 weeks ago, and the faces visible in the firelight were the same faces that had been unfamiliar on the first Sunday and were now something else. Counselor Ruth Levine, 19, third summer at Camp Pinewood, was standing across the fire ring from Ellie. She could see the candle in Ellie's hand. She could see what the evening was doing in Ellie before Ellie had any words for it. Ruth had watched the closing ceremony from this same position 3 times before, and she had been Ellie in this same fire ring at 12, on the closing evening of her own first session, with a candle in her hand and the camp song in her throat, and the specific sensation of something ending that she had not known, on day 1, she would ever want to continue. What was happening in Ellie Greenbaum at the edge of that fire ring, and what had the 53 days between the unfinished letter and this moment organized in her that the closing ceremony was now? Before you can understand what was happening in Ellie Greenbaum at the edge of the fire ring on the closing evening, you need to understand what the closing ceremony was designed to do, and what Camp Pinewood understood it was completing. The closing ceremony of an American residential summer camp was not an event added to the end of the session. It was the session's culminating form, the moment when the summer's social and developmental architecture was publicly acknowledged before it was dissolved. Camps had organized these ceremonies since the earliest decades of the tradition. ACA historical records and published camp histories document closing campfire rituals at residential camps across the Northeast and Midwest from the 1920s onward. At Wyonegonic camps in Maine, the final night brought all campers to the lake in canoes holding lanterns, singing traditional songs. At Rockbrook Camp in the Carolinas, a spirit fire tradition documented across more than a century gathered the entire community shoulder to shoulder at the lakeside fire ring for a shared candlelight ceremony. The specific forms varied by camp and region. What they shared was the understanding that the ending required marking, that what had been built over weeks of living together deserved a form of closing that acknowledged its weight. Camp Pinewood's closing ceremony did what every well-organized camp closing ceremony did. It asked the community to perform its own transition, not to experience it passively, but to enact it together, in a specific order, with a specific ritual architecture that had been refined across many previous sessions. The fire at the center. The candles passed from counselor to camper. The camp song, which sounded different tonight because everyone who sang it knew they were singing it for the last time this summer. Before we continue, if this channel's documentation is what you have been looking for, consider subscribing. Every video goes into one specific element of the American residential summer camp between 1920 and 1980. The bunk, the waterfront, the counselor who knew what 2:30 on day 3 meant before the child had words for it, and the specific developmental interval, the long session organized. Not nostalgia for campfire songs. The documented reality of a social institution that built something specific in children through a specific design over a specific duration that the shorter structured programs that replaced it were not designed to produce. The closing ceremony of an 8-week camp session was the moment when a child who had arrived wanting to go home discovered, without anyone telling them, that they were not willing to leave. And if you attended a residential summer camp and experienced a closing ceremony, a final campfire, a candle ceremony, a last time the camp song was sung, put in the comments the specific moment from the closing ceremony you still carry. Not the whole evening. One moment. Next, the social world of the bunk, 6 or 8 children who had not chosen each other, and what 8 weeks of enforced proximity built in them that no chosen community could have produced in the same form. Back at the bunk, The days before the closing ceremony had their own texture, distinct from every other period of the session. Ellie had noticed it 2 days earlier when the trunks came out. The trunk, the same wooden or canvas travel chest that had arrived on the first Sunday with the smell of home still in its contents, now had to be repacked. What went into it was not what had come out of it in June. Clothes that had been folded by her mother in Crown Heights were now worn smooth from washing, or had been left at the bottom of the clothing shelf for weeks. What went in alongside them? The lanyard she had made in crafts, the leather token from the closing ceremony that the camp awarded to campers who completed a full session, the rolled-up photograph from the waterfront activity that showed her in the stern of a canoe she had not known how to steer on the first Monday. The ACA's documentation of transitional objects from camp closing ceremonies notes this pattern specifically. Children returned home with small material objects, leather tokens, painted ceramic pieces, cloth badges, that they kept for decades without entirely knowing why. The objects did not represent what the summer had been. They were evidence that the summer had occurred. There was a difference. The last swim in the lake had a different quality than every other swim. Ellie had been in that lake every morning for 53 days. She knew the temperature of it at 6 in the morning and what it felt like to break the surface before breakfast. On the last morning, she went in last. She came out last. The counselor on the dock noted it. She knew what the last swim looked like, what was being packed into the trunk, alongside the lanyard and the photograph, and what would not fit. The closing ceremony of Camp Pinewood followed a structure that had been refined across many previous sessions. Not a rigid script. The specific words and sequence varied year to year as the staff changed, but a deliberate architecture, built from the understanding that the transition the ceremony needed to produce required specific conditions. The gathering of the whole camp in one space. This was not a small matter. For most of the session, the camp had operated in its constituent groups, the bunks, the waterfront divisions, the activity groups. On the closing evening, all of those separations dissolved. The girl from Bunk 3 and the girl from Bunk 9 stood at the same fire ring, holding the same candles, singing the same songs. The ceremony temporarily reconstituted the camp as a single community, which was what the community had always been and rarely experienced as a unified whole. The fire at the center. ECA records and published camp histories document the campfire as the constant element of closing ceremonies across camp types and regions from the 1920s onward. The fire did not represent anything that a program director had to explain. A fire in the dark, around which a community has gathered. The meaning was structural, not symbolic. It required no interpretation. The candle passing. At many residential camps, the act of lighting one candle from another, from director to senior counselor, to junior counselor, to older camper to younger camper, was the ceremony's central physical ritual. What it enacted was not metaphorical. It was a literal demonstration of transmission. Something moves from one person to another, and the original flame is not diminished. The camp song, last, not first, last. Because what the song required was the weight of everything that had preceded it. What did the ceremony's architecture produce in a child who had not chosen to be moved by any of it? And why did the structure work even when the child arrived at the fire ring, with no intention of feeling what the fire was designed to produce? Ruth Levine had not been trained to know what the closing ceremony would do to Ellie Greenbaum. The counselor orientation at Camp Pinewood had covered the closing ceremony's logistical elements, the gathering order, the candle procedure, the awards distribution, the camp song sequence. It had not covered the specific thing that happened in first-year campers at the closing fire who had arrived 53 days earlier with an unfinished letter on their bunks. Ruth knew it, because she had been that first-year camper at 12, at this camp, at this fire ring. She knew it because she had watched 3 previous closing ceremonies from the counselor's position and had seen the same arc complete itself in the children she had been responsible for. the girl who had refused to participate in the waterfront program in week 2, who was now standing in the ceremony circle, singing the camp song with the group. The girl who had been the last to stop asking when visiting day was who was now holding a candle she had not wanted to extinguish. Not because the summer had been perfect, because it had been real. 53 days of real. The cold morning lake, the bunk community with its unchosen social pressures, the activity period that had not been her preference, the Wednesday letter home that had been harder to write in week 6 than in week 1 because there was more to say than fit. All of this was real. And the closing ceremony was the moment when real was acknowledged and named before it ended. What the experienced counselor knew that the first-year counselor did not. The closing ceremony's work was not producing emotion. The emotion was already there, built by the 53 days. The ceremony was simply giving it a form. What the ceremony organized was not feeling. It organized permission, the permission to acknowledge, publicly and together, what the summer had been. What had 53 days built in Ellie Greenbaum? The child who had not wanted to be here was not willing to leave. This is the fact that the closing ceremony's emotional power rested on, and that no amount of prior knowledge or deliberate preparation reliably changed. Dr. Christopher Thurber's research, documented by the ACA, found that 83% of campers reported homesickness on at least one day of camp, and that the intensity of that homesickness was typically concentrated in the first week. What the same research also documents, and what experienced camp counselors had observed without research confirmation for decades, was the inversion. The children who were most intensely homesick in week 1 were frequently the most deeply affected by the ending. Ellie Greenbaum had been in the camp for 53 days. She had had an unfinished letter on day 3, because the words she had started with on day 1 were no longer accurate. By day 7, something had arrived that nobody had given her. By week 4, the lake was no longer a cold, dark body of water that was not the bathtub at home. It was the lake. By week 7, the community of the bunk, 6 girls she had not chosen, was the specific community that had produced a specific social knowledge of each other that could not be replicated by the same number of girls who had known each other since kindergarten. The closing ceremony was designed to mark the ending of that world, not to preserve it. The world of Camp Pinewood's first session, 1953, was ending whether or not it was marked, but to give it the acknowledgement that it merited. The camp had organized a passage and a belonging over 53 days without ever announcing what it was doing. The closing ceremony was the moment when the camp acknowledged, publicly and together, that something real had happened here. The girl who was crying at the fire ring had not expected to be crying. That was the specific quality of the moment that Ruth Levine could read across the fire and that no training document had ever needed to describe. What had the camp organized over 53 days without announcing it that was now ending? The closing ceremony of Camp Pinewood gathered a specific community at a specific fire ring in August of 1953, and who was in that community was determined by conditions that were real, structured, and not incidental to what the ceremony was completing. Camp Pinewood served predominantly Jewish families from Brooklyn and the surrounding New York metropolitan area, families who could afford the 8-week camp fee, who had access to the social networks through which families in Crown Heights heard about Vermont lake camps, and who were white. American summer camp culture in the 1950s was broadly segregated. Documented scholarship notes that by the early 1950s, less than half of urban IMSCA chapters offered integrated camping. The children at Camp Pinewood's fire ring in 1953 were there because of access conditions that excluded the majority of American children of the same age. The exceptions were specific and notable. Camp Wo-Chi-Che, Workers' Children's Camp, supported by labor unions, racially integrated, run in upstate New York from the mid-1930s through the early 1950s, named its bunks after Harriet Tubman. Paul Robeson visited. The closing ceremony at an integrated camp carried a different social weight. What the fire ring acknowledged was not only the summer's activities, but the specific experiment of having placed children from different racial backgrounds in the same 8-week community. At Camp Pinewood, the closing ceremony carried the specific cultural weight of the Jewish residential camp tradition. The Havdalah ceremony, braided candle, spices, song. The ritual of marking a separation from the holy to the ordinary was observed weekly at Jewish camps and lent its liturgical language to the session's final evening. The last Havdalah of the summer was not the same as the previous 8. What did the specific social and cultural context of the camp, who was gathered at the fire ring, determine about what the ceremony was completing? Camp Pinewood, Lake Champlain, Vermont. Departure morning, August 1953. Ellie Greenbaum's parents arrived in their car from Crown Heights. They had been waiting for this morning since the first Sunday of the session, when they had driven away from this dock, with Ellie's face visible in the car window of another vehicle heading north. They had received 8 letters. They had kept all 8 in the kitchen drawer. When Ellie walked toward the car, her mother saw something. Not a specific thing, a quality. The same face, the same walk, the same child who had stood in the driveway in Crown Heights 53 days earlier with a trunk that still smelled of home. Something in the bearing was different, in the way that things are different when a person has been in a place and been shaped by it. Published accounts from parents who picked up children from residential camps in this era describe the departure morning with the same consistent quality. The child they were meeting was the child they had sent, and was also not exactly the child they had sent. The summer had not replaced her. It had added a specific layer that the drive home could not yet fully account for. The drive from Lake Champlain to Crown Heights took the better part of a day. What happened in that car, the specific conversation about the summer, about the closing fire, about the specific moment of the ceremony that Ellie described in terms her mother did not fully receive, became part of the family's story. A former camper, describing the camp experience decades later, would often begin with that drive home. The closing ceremony's weight traveled in the car. What the child was carrying had not yet been fully named, and the naming would take longer than the drive. What did Ellie's mother see walking toward the car, and what did she already understand, and not yet understand, about what the 53 days had built in the child now loading her trunk? Ellie Greenbaum put the leather token in the drawer of her desk in Crown Heights. It was there for years afterward, not displayed, not disposed of, simply present, with the implicit status of an object that the drawer held, because the drawer was where it went. She would not have been able to explain why she kept it, because the explanation would have required describing what the token was evidence of, and that description was longer than the question warranted. The ACA's documented research on camp closing ceremony transitional objects notes this pattern precisely. Former campers kept small objects, leather circles, cloth badges, painted wooden tokens, for decades, in drawers and boxes, without fully knowing why. The objects did not represent what the summer had been. They were evidence that it had occurred. The summer had been 53 days of specific, accumulated, unrepeatable experience. The token was a small piece of leather. The relationship between them was not symbolic. It was testimonial. What Ellie also carried home was the camp song, not as text. The printed program from the closing ceremony was in her trunk, but the song was elsewhere. It was in the specific form of 50 voices singing it in a specific fire ring on a specific August night at a specific pitch and tempo that would never be exactly replicated. When she heard the song again, at a camp reunion, at a younger sibling session, at her own daughter's closing ceremony decades later, what the song activated was not the words. It was the specific community that had produced that specific sound at that specific fire. The closing ceremony belonged not only to the summer of 1953, but to all the summers Camp Pinewood had held before it. The fire ring had contained this ceremony before Ellie arrived. What it completed each time was specific and unrepeatable. The ceremony's repetition across years gave it a weight that transcended any individual summer, but what each summer contributed to it was its own. What did Ellie carry home in the drawer, with the token that the token itself could not contain? Camp Pinewood began offering a 4-week session option in 1971. By 1977, more than half the enrollment chose 4 weeks over 8. The 4-week session had a closing ceremony, same fire ring, same candle passing, same camp song. The ceremony was not eliminated. Its architecture was maintained. What changed was what the ceremony was completing. The 4-week session ended on day 28. The child at the fire ring on day 28 had been at camp for 28 days. The ceremony's structure asked the community to acknowledge what had been built. What had been built in 28 days was real, but the closing ceremony's emotional power, documented across a century of camp tradition, came from the relationship between the ceremony's architecture and what had preceded it. The architecture was the same. What had preceded it was not. The turn that arrived by day 7 of the 8-week session. The specific shift from the camp being a place you were in to a place you were part of, had 5 more weeks to build on it in the long session. The closing ceremony of the 8-week session was completing a